negative attitude towards Africa. In San Francisco, on African Liberation Day, Brother Walter Rodney, an African historian, noted both the importance of African Liberation Day in terms of our African identity and some of the root causes for our problem of identification.
I have met brothers and sisters who say that their mother tongue, quote unquote, is French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as English, which we speak. And because of this, we have a problem of identification. We do not know whom we are. And that is why this gathering is of great symbolic importance, because it is an act of identification. We are saying that we identify with the African people of the African continent. We are saying that we are an African people. And when we make this identification, have no illusions about the fact that this is a very revolutionary initiative. It is a rejection of every other form of identification which the white society has asked us to accept. Let me draw your attention to something which white universities and white libraries practice. And this is a university community. Numerous universities lie around this land. You go into their libraries and check the Library of Congress cards. Under Europe or European, you will find all entries listed concerning the continent of Europe. You will also find entries listed about Europeans in East Africa, Europeans in North Africa, Europeans in Asia and Australia. Look under the Chinese, you will find entries listed not only for mainland China, but for Malaysia and for the Chinese in North America. But look on the Africa and the Africans, the only entries on the Africans relate to the continent itself. There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negroes.
Okay. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Weekly Pan-African News. My name is Onyesonwu. I am joined by my comrade Rashad. Hey, Rashad.
What's up, y'all?
And we are both members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party Southwest Chapter. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary Pan-African socialist political party, a mass political party for our people, founded over 50 years ago by Kwame Nkrumah, the first democratically elected president of Ghana after Ghana gained its independence from British colonialism. Nkrumah realized wisely that Ghana's independence was going to be meaningless if all of Africa and the African diaspora was still colonized. And so in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, which he wrote after he was couped by the US government in Britain, he called for the formation of our organization, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking to you. So we do this show, Weekly Pan-African News, actually bi-weekly on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, you might notice the setup looks like a little bit different, and that's because my computer is garbage. So we're trying the Restream Studio rather than what we had previously been using, open broadcasting software. And so we are definitely depending on y'all to let us know if there are any issues. If you have issues hearing or seeing us, if like the stream gets choppy, like please let us know. We're testing this out, seeing if it's going to be a little bit better. But if you are a frequent watcher of the show, you know that we always start off with a couple of things. We always introduce ourselves, which I just did. And we also start with a land acknowledgement and an ancestor reverence. So the ancestors that we want to call in today, we have two revolutionary African ancestors. The first one is El Haj Malik El Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, revolutionary Pan-African. The man was a Pan-Africanist, also a Black nationalist who fought for African liberation, who formed organizations wherever he went. The last one was the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which sought to unify African people throughout the Western Hemisphere, because when Malcolm X said Afro-American, he meant all of the Africans in the Americas because he was a Pan-Africanist. So he was murdered on this day, on the 21st, which I believe was Monday, by our enemies. The Nation of Islam pulled the trigger, but Uncle Sam bought the bullets. The NYPD and the FBI infiltrated the Nation of Islam, created a large amount of dissent, and used that chaos that they created to antagonize Malcolm X, and ultimately were able to exploit it in order to kill him. And the reason why they killed him is because he was seeking to unify our people. He was seeking to unify us for our liberation, organize us for our liberation. He was also increasingly critical of capitalism and imperialism, which is what made him the actual threat. And he had begun to build ties with revolutionary African national liberation movements across the continent. When he made that trip to Mecca, that you are probably familiar with, we were told that he just changed his mind about Europeans, which, he got like a more nuanced view about them. But the other thing he did on that same trip was meet with revolutionary African leaders across the continent, including Sekou Touré, including Kwame Nkrumah. So he was building ties transnationally to strengthen the African national liberation movement. The U.S. government could not have that, and so they conspired to have him murdered for fighting for us. The other ancestor that we want to call in is W.B. Du Bois. His birthday was actually yesterday. He was born on February 23rd, 1868. He lived, I believe, to like almost 100 years old. He had a long, long life, and he had like 4 or 5 lifetimes in that one life. He started off, kind of petty B, talking about like the talented 10, talking about like the upper echelon of African people need to lead us to liberation. Then the world wars broke out, and he was like, holy crap, maybe the African liberation struggle needs a global focus. Maybe we're not going to realize liberation within the borders of this empire. Then he began building Pan-African connections, helped organize the first Pan-African Congress, brought national liberation struggles, Pan-African activists together from all over the world in London, to help develop this program that developed into the political objective of one unified socialist Africa, became a full-on communist, and then moved to Ghana to help support Kwame Nkrumah after Ghana's independence to write an African encyclopedia. So this was a man who started off kind of confused, kind of classist is what I'll say, and he ended up a revolutionary Pan-African communist in Ghana under Nkrumah, building ties with China, building ties with the USSR. So, people sometimes slander Du Bois, particularly because he had like that beef with Garvey, which, he was far from the only one. And also Garvey gave it back. And also it was exacerbated by the feds, as the feds do. Same thing they did with the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. So people will use the beef with Garvey to like dismiss Du Bois entirely, to be like, oh, he was a traitor, oh, he was a sellout. They'll use the complexion to dismiss him entirely. I've heard people say he was too light-skinned to trust. I was like, okay. But what we need to understand is that this man dedicated his life to the African liberation struggle. And as his analysis advanced, as he got less and less confused, as he began to understand that socialism and communism were the only path to liberation for African people, he got it together. He made his contribution. So he should be held up alongside Garvey, alongside Nkrumah, alongside El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, and we can't like denigrate them for making mistakes, especially if they corrected them. So yeah, shout out to Du Bois. He is unquestionably a hero of the African Revolution. Shout out to Malcolm X, also unquestionably a hero of the African Revolution. If you disagree, I do not care. So that's the ancestor. Last thing that we want to do is we just want to say that we are speaking to y'all. So I'm speaking to y'all from occupied Tiwa territory, aka Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then where are you, Rashad?
I'm out here in occupied Ute territory, or what they call Denver, Colorado.
And all of the United Snakes, in fact, most of the Western Hemisphere is straight up stolen land. And not only is it stolen land, stolen by Europeans during their conquest of the planet to build global capitalism, the people that it was stolen from are still here. We work with people of the Tiwa Pueblo all the time here in Albuquerque. They are fighting for their land back. They are fighting to stop extraction of oil and resources that are destroying the planet. They're in fact the front line of the global struggle against climate destruction. So their land was stolen. They're fighting for it back. We're going to help them get it back because land was stolen in Africa too. Our land was stolen. Their land was stolen. That's a clear basis of unity. So when we do a land acknowledgement in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we're not just saying it just to say it. It's a promise. they're going to get their land back. Africans are going to get our land back. Palestinians are going to get their land back. Indigenous Australians are going to get their land back, period. So, yeah. And now I've talked enough, and I will pass it to Rashad to give us our main political education spiel.
So, folks, today, the focus of today in this week's weekly Pan African News is why Black History Month should be African Liberation Month. And so, obviously February is Black History Month over here in the Western Hemisphere in North America and Canada and stuff. I don't know. I can't remember what it's like in Africa, but I don't think they do the Black History Month thing as much in Africa. So yeah, it's really a thing over here, and that's part of what we'll get into and why the renaming of Black History Month and renaming it and reframing it as African Liberation Month is important, and so we'll get into that later. But so first of all, we want to talk about the inception of Black History Month and where it comes from, and the ideas, how it started out. And so pretty sure most folks know that it was basically started by Carter G. Woodson in 1920, and as like a way to celebrate the Black past and stuff like that, and to honor the people that came before him. And people will say that he basically created it at that time around the two people, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Of course I forget his name. So yeah, the people will say that he framed it around them. But even from its inception in 1920, when it started out as Negro History Week, Negro History Literature Week, he was already trying to separate it from being just a celebration of those two people. And so, even though that might be how it started and everything, he was already working from its inception to move it away from just from especially from Black people, from the complete focus on Frederick Douglass, and then obviously the supposed praise of fucking Abraham Lincoln. So eventually in 1926, they dropped the Literature Week, and it just became Negro History Week, because towards the 30s, Black people, and especially like middle class Black people, had already started to they wanted more, and we wanted more education for our children, and we wanted to be a part of the movement and stuff like that, and be a part of probably at that time what I would say more integration, and being or at the very least celebrating our past. And so the Black masses had got involved, and it became a little bit more. So he dropped the Literature Week. He dropped the literature part of the week, and it became just Negro History Week, and it became an annual thing that he did, and that the people he was working with, the ASLAH, were working with to try and build upon its initial inception and its initial ideas. And so eventually Carter G. Woodson, he's funny. I like studying him because he always got the idea that things could be co-opted, and that there were people that were there were Africans and white people who were insistent upon making Negro History Week a thing that was just celebrated once a week. He was trying to move it forward to have it be celebrated and be taught year round, especially amongst our schools and liberation schools that people were already starting to build and stuff like that. So he was always real critical of the way in which things could be co-opted by the petty bourgeoisie of our class, and also the white ruling class. And so he never really got to see it because he died in 1950, I think. And so he'd see it become Black History Month in 1976. But what I would say is that he wasn't even working for it to just be a month. You know what I mean? What it became co-opted into. He was working for it to be what it should be, is a year-round long process of decolonization and dedication to African history and African liberation. And so we'll get into exactly when it became Black History Month and exactly like why the reasons and why we should change it from Black History Month to African Liberation Month. And so we know that in 1976 it became Black History Month, and towns and places all over and mayors, the white mayors and stuff, started petitioning, and they started having stuff for Black History Month to be celebrated in their cities and their towns, and it became a national thing in 1976. And literally ever since then, it's just been co-opted into something that's been rebranded into fitting into the structures of capitalism. And so we went through. There's three articles. There's three hood communist articles that we went through that that have been posted throughout the years. One was in 2013 by I can't remember the brother's name, but it was a Jamu. It wasn't a Jamu Barack or a Jamu Umi. It was someone else. Well, someone from Canada, and they talked about how the need to reassert. We have to reassert the name. We have to change the name because names mean a lot. And so for it to be Black History Month, we see how it's been framed into a way that goes away from struggle and liberation. It's been co-opted, and it's been funneled into a straight study of great men and first Black people, and it's just, it deviates from the radical politics of what we need. And so in the first article, Ajamu talked about the things that we need to do to aside from renaming it Black History Month. I mean, aside from renaming it African Liberation Month, the things we need to do to to make it not just lip service and not just a changing of the name, but actual progress towards African liberation. And so one of those is that we have to engage the systematic political education of our people. And that's part of the whole thing that they've done, is that they've went away from we've gotten away, and we've allowed them to co-opt it to a point that we don't even focus on the organizations. It's all about what Martin Luther King did and hopes and dreams, or what Malcolm X did. We know these people are great leaders and stuff like that. We know that, and we know we needed them. But at the same time, there has never been a point in time where the organized masses didn't advance the struggle. And so we learn that from Kwame Ture all the time, and how he talks about organization is the tool of the oppressed. And so that's one of the things that we have to do. And we know that, us in these spaces, especially at the AAPRP, that's our main goal, is organizing the people so that we can begin to have a dynamic understanding and a dynamic ways of reacting and being proactive against the capitalist imperialist system. And so what so another way they've done this, another way they've done the way another way they've gotten us to not focus on organization and not focus on the collective, and instead focus on individuals, is the infiltration of non-government organizations, the NGOs and the nonprofit organizations. And we see this with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how those things, they tear away at our resolve, they tear away at our need to fight. Because, well, why do we need to fight if why do we need to fight if we keep getting funded by the people who are by our oppressors? And if it's just going to be, if Black History Month is just going to be framed on Black person being the first next thing, then that's where it'll stay, and that's where it'll go. And then we'll always get funneled into the Democratic Party, and it'll always be a framing of Black excellence in terms of Black capitalism, and Black liberation being synonymous with Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurship. And so, we know none of these things are necessarily in and of itself bad. You know what I mean? Like, we love Black excellence. You know what I mean? Of course, and we love You know, we love what black girls do, and we know that what they do is, you know, we love what they do. But you know, when we start framing it as black girl magic, and when that gets funneled and co-opted to just mean something superficial, and it doesn't relate to the material realities of what actual Africans are going, of what is happening to Africans in the whole diaspora, especially on the continent, we lose our direction. We lose our direction because the direction, as you know, as we're saying, should be African liberation and not just a celebration of the first black or the exceptional black or the wealthiest black, and so the wealthiest African. So that's that's one of the main things. That's one of the main things that we have to do is start with the name. We have to start with the name because that'll help it to click with our people, because we get away from the naming of black, which doesn't have any position in the world, you know what I mean? And so, you know, although, you know, we are black Africans, if we rename it African Liberation Month, African is what it is. That's who we are. That's our land. And it centers that. And that's the most important thing, to center Africa, because we understand that our history didn't start in the New World. It didn't start in the Caribbean. Um, it didn't obviously start in fucking America. So it started in Africa. And we know at the, you know, our message at the AAPRP is one united Africa under scientific socialism. And so we have to the focus has to be on Africa, and it can't just be on what's going on in the United States and Canada with supposed African Americans, or I don't even know what you would call Africans in Canada. I don't know if they have a name like a Afri. I don't even know, but you know, but we're Africans in a given place. Malcolm X, you know, Malcolm X once said, "You don't if you put a cat in the oven, you don't call it biscuits when it comes out. It's just a cat. It's dead and burnt, but it's still a cat. You know what I mean?" And so, so we didn't change our name. We're not, you know, we didn't change our name. We are Africans in a given colonial um, structure in settlement. That's, you know, that's what we are. And I guess lastly what I'll bring up about it is that we've gotten into that space where it's unfortunate because we just don't know enough about Africa. Like people in America, in Canada, Africans in America and Canada who grew up and were born here, we just don't know enough about Africa. We haven't been taught, and we've been actively led to other directions. And so we get another article that we read from Hood Communists. I'm sorry, I can't remember who wrote that one either. But I think it was just the collective. It was the why we say fuck Black History Month, and it was a collective of writers who came together and wrote it. And so what they talked about was that the whole thing around Wakanda and how every story that gets related back to Africans in America that relates to Africa is just it's it's rooted in fantasy, and it has nothing to do with the material realities of what Africans go through on the continent, have been through, and how it relates to us here, and how it's all interconnected, and it's one continuous story of all of us in the diaspora. And so I'll get more questions. We'll talk about it more, but you know, ultimately we can't. We have to. It starts with the name. It starts with the name and the complete reframing of it from Black History Month, and taking it away from the white people and from any other African who wants to co-opt it and to use it to get into a career that upholds American hegemony and capitalism and imperialism. we have to cut it right the fuck there and rename it African Liberation Month and actually do the things that will support that, what that means. And that goes back to getting our people organized in revolutionary organizations that are fighting against the system in its entirety, and centering Africa, and learning our history, decolonizing our minds, and ultimately, obviously, being unified. I don't want to be, how when people say, unity and stuff, but unity presupposes organization. And so that's our main focus, because once we start focusing on the collective and the organization, and how the organization of and how when we organize together, how that will serve our liberation, and not being focused on trying to get the next Malcolm X, or the next great person. That's what we have to do. And I also forgot a point about the fact that they mentioned in their not mentioning at all the radical women in the movement, and that's part and parcel of the whole thing, of the whole, it being co-opted into being one great person, or one great man, or one great leader. And we know it's always going to be a man. It can never be a woman. Even if we are focusing on one great person, it's never a woman. And so that's another thing. We have to start highlighting and centering the women that were in the movement, and are often, even if they weren't the most prominent women, we already understand that women are the backbone of the whole movement, and the masses of the people in general, regardless of their gender or sex or ability, are a part of the movement, and the most integral part, regardless of who we have as our spokespeople or our leaders. It's the masses of the people that move history forward. And so, yeah, we can get into it, but yeah, that's our case basically for why we should rename Black History Month to African Liberation Month.
I feel like that was well explained. I don't really have a lot to add, but basically the gist is that Black History Month has been co-opted. That's why Home Depot, Delta Airlines, Nike, Apple had their red, black, and green watch. Like corporate America, the capitalist system feels extremely comfortable with Black History Month as it currently exists. We as African people have to understand that our struggle is global, and that we have to celebrate it on a global basis. Consider our history on a global basis. African history does not start with slavery in the Western Hemisphere. African history starts thousands of years ago and extends all over the planet. So definitely 100% agree with what the comrade has shared. Also dropped in the chat the two articles that were being discussed, why we build African Liberation Month, and then why we say fuck Black History Month. So I encourage folks to check that out. But thank you so much, Rashad. Well done. There's like people... Oh, there's people speaking Russian in the chat, and there's KD in work study responding in Russian. What is going on?
That's because KD's he's too good. Like KD's too good.
Hilarious. I don't know what's going on.
He seems like he knows exactly what the hell is going on too.
Strange. Okay, cool. So that was the political education segment of the program. Why we need to build African Liberation Month. Remember, we are an African people, period. Our struggle is a global struggle. Our history is a global history. So it should be inclusive of who we actually are. But now we want to move on to some updates on current events, also known as world geopolitical. That's what it's called in work study. So we're going to call it that in the show. So first up, you have, without question, you're trolling. KD is not responding.
Because it's the bots. They really, okay. The bots.
Let me block them. I thought that you were all having a conversation. It was a real person. Okay.
Yeah, they got to tell me about that VU, whatever the hell that is.
It's straight. I have to look at what that is. But anywho, so current events. You probably know at this point that Russia is currently in Ukraine, attacking military facilities after Putin yesterday evening gave a speech in which he basically said that's what he's going to do. He said in that speech, we're going to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. And as the speech was happening, at the same time as the UN Security Council was convening to condemn Russia, Russia sent troops into Ukraine. Russia used submarines to launch missiles, drones, and whatnot to attack Ukraine, specifically military installations in Ukraine. So, of course, in the Western media, particularly in the United States, all hell broke loose. People were like, this is World War III. People were like, he's Hitler. People were like, what's going on? Calling for humanitarian intervention. It has been quite incredible to see. There's also been, as there always is in the modern era of warfare, an intense amount of misinformation about what's actually happening on Twitter. I saw people posting pictures from Syria, from Colombia, from Japan, saying it was video of Russia attacking Ukraine. I saw people claiming that hundreds of civilians have been killed, countless civilians have been killed, and the Ukrainian government itself has said so far only 10 civilians have been killed. So there's like a massive amount of misinformation out there right now that folks have to sift through. And also we have this situation where people are analyzing what's happening, why Russia is attacking these military installations in Ukraine, but they're starting from like the end of the story, or rather like the middle of the story. Like the actual story of what is happening and why it's happening starts in 2014 when the US government and NATO aligned to depose a democratically elected president in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people picked that man. That man decided to sign a trade agreement with Russia instead of the United States. It provoked protests by anti-Russia forces in Ukraine that the US and NATO were like, ooh, we can use those. Let's see what we can do. And so they found like the most organized segment of those protests, which happened to be neo-Nazis and fascists. They started funding, arming, and training them. The situation quickly escalated to violence, and the democratically elected president of Ukraine was overthrown. The Nazis that were funded and trained by the US were best positioned to seize power in the aftermath. And so a puppet leader who was also anti-Russia, pro-Europe, was put into power. The Nazi battalions that had fought in the war against Russia became official regiments of the Ukrainian National Guard. Far-right and Nazi political parties got seats in Ukraine's parliament. This is all happening in 2014, 2015. And there were two regions of Ukraine who saw what was happening, who saw the Nazis come to power, who saw the fascists come to power, who saw immediately after this happened, this beginning of rehabilitating far-right political figures like Stephen Bandera, who committed mass programs against Jewish people and Polish people during World War II, who was aligned with Hitler, all of a sudden was held up as a national hero of Ukraine. All of a sudden, Nazi history, Nazi genocide denial was like mainstream political discourse in Ukraine. All of a sudden, they were knocking down statues of Lenin. All of a sudden, communist parties were banned in Ukraine. And so the people in Donbass and Crimea were like, actually, no, thank you. We don't actually want a Nazi government. We would actually rather turn to Russia. So that's when you start to hear about the so-called Russian annexation of Crimea. But what actually happened is that in 2014, Crimea had a national referendum where 80% of the people eligible to vote in that region had a vote about whether or not they wanted to join Russia. It passed by over 90%. They voted, over 90% of them voted to join Russia. But then the UN Security Council, under pressure from the United States, decided to ignore the referendum and instead spread the lie that Russia had forcibly annexed Crimea. But like I said, the people of Crimea turned to Russia in the first place because US and NATO forces put in power far-right and neo-Nazi political parties. And these people, like, you have to understand that Nazis tried to invade Russia to enslave these people. Millions of them died fighting the Nazis. They are anti-Nazi. And so they were like, we don't actually want a Nazi government, especially one chosen by outside forces. That's why that happened. So then the Nazi forces escalate tensions with Russia, a full-out war breaks out, the Russo Ukrainian War, particularly in the Donbas region. Neo-Nazi forces, who are now, again, official regiments of the Ukrainian National Guard, who were openly funded and trained by US, UK, Canada, NATO powers, are now attacking Ukrainians who are anti-Nazi. And I'm laughing because it's absurd. Are attacking Ukrainian forces who are anti-Nazi in Donbass. The Russia-aligned folks. Eventually, even though they were backed by NATO, the Nazis, the people in Donbass, were able to force them to a ceasefire, force them to like the negotiating table. 2 agreements were drawn up as a consequence of those negotiations. Minsk I and Minsk II. And basically what those agreements say is that the Donbas region of Ukraine would still be part of Ukraine, but would be governed autonomously. They didn't want a Nazi government. So they're like, we're just gonna have our own. And Ukraine agreed to that. There were also additional agreements about a ceasefire, saying the neo-Nazis could not commit atrocities against the civilians in Donbass. Everybody involved agreed to it. It was basically like the most peaceful resolution to what was happening. But what happened? The US pressured the far-right government in Ukraine to ignore the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. Instead, they continued pumping weapons into Ukraine, continued gassing Ukraine up to attack these people. And so in the 8-year period from 2014 till now, thousands of people have been killed in this fighting in Donbass. Thousands of people. So when people were like freaking out, like, oh my God, staying with people in Ukraine last night, it was like they've been dying for 8 years. They've been being killed by US and NATO donated weapons for 8 years. Now all of a sudden you care? What is going on? So yeah, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the far-right forces, ignored the ceasefire, continued wailing on these people. And so this past week, what happened is that Putin gave a speech where he was basically like, if y'all are not going to agree to what you signed up for, Minsk I and Minsk II, if y'all are not going to be interested in a peaceful agreement, if y'all are going to keep attacking Donbass, then we are going to recognize the independence of these 2 regions in Donbass, and we are going to support them against you. That is what got us to this point. It wasn't all of a sudden, like the US media is extremely invested in making people believe that Putin is just like a raging maniac. And I'm not going to sit here and argue that Putin is progressive because the man is not. He is not. He is conservative. He is anti-communist. He is sketchy as all hell. Very true. But in this particular situation, he is not wrong. He is saying, why are you asking Ukraine to join NATO? Why are you surrounding us with military bases? Why are you constantly antagonizing us? You don't want us to exist because we go against Western hegemony. And he is correct. So what's happening now is that the US, thanks to irrational diplomacy of the Biden administration, has forced Putin's hand. Putin is like, you all are clearly interested in escalating the situation as much as possible because you want to antagonize Russia. So I'm going to give y'all what you are looking for. The discourse around the speech he gave is that he was calling for the reformation of the USSR. He's planning to invade Ukraine, and he's going on to Lithuania, and et cetera, and so on and so forth. If you actually read the speech he gave, he doesn't actually say that. He actually says some anti-communist shit, and then he spends over half of the speech laying out in great detail all of the NATO facilities or the NATO-backed facilities in Ukraine that are a direct threat to Russia. All of the places where they could fire nuclear weapons and missiles that are a direct threat to Russia. He says it in detail. He says that we cannot allow y'all to continue to expand this alliance that is directly antagonistic to us, not all the way up to our borders. Absolutely not. Russia has legitimate security concerns. And if you look at the history of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was literally formed as an explicitly anti-Russia military alliance of Western imperialist powers. They formed that shit so they could attack the Soviet Union. That's why Russia is like, can you stop expanding it? Because they know why it's there. They know why it's there. And as African people, we have no business whatsoever aligning with the US or NATO in this particular situation. Because NATO not only was explicitly formed as an anti-Russia military alliance of Western imperialist powers, it has also been instrumental in violently repressing African anti-colonial struggles throughout history. When the PIGC was fighting Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, NATO sent troops, weapons, and planes to attack the anti-colonial struggle in Guinea-Bissau. Portugal was like a backwater. Portugal on its own could not maintain colonies and fight multiple anti-colonial wars in Africa. At one point, there were 3 anti-colonial wars against Portugal happening at the same time in Africa. Portugal on its own could never have done that. If it had been just Portugal, they would have been wiped out. What happened was that NATO propped Portugal up to maintain the colonization of African people and land. So NATO is not only anti-Russia, NATO is explicitly anti-communist, and NATO is an explicit white supremacist coalition of imperialist forces that are hostile to African national liberation projects. So that is why when you hear about NATO wanting to expand, whether it's to Ukraine, whether it's to Mexico, which the Atlantic Council actually raised a couple of years ago, we have to oppose it as African people fighting for our people's liberation, because it might be pointing at Russia today, but best believe if Russia goes down, it's coming for all of us. It's coming for all anti-colonial, all anti-imperialist struggles. So yeah, let me see what y'all saying. I am sure there's someone in the chat mad. Let me see. Let me see if you are angry or if I forgot something. So KD says the U.S. supporting reactionary elements of a society presided over by a democratically elected leader. This story sounds oddly familiar. It should, because they constantly do this. They constantly back fascist and far-right forces against anti-imperialist and socialist governments. They did it in Venezuela, and when they did it in Venezuela, the people they backed, the Guarimbas, were literally setting African people on fire in the street. And then the US media was reporting that like freedom fighters in Venezuela, they were lynching us. And the US knew that was happening. They knew it was happening. And they still backed them. They still funded and trained them to overthrow first Chavez, then Maduro. They did the same thing in Cuba. They have repeatedly aligned with far-right Cuban exiles to engage in terrorist attacks against the Cuban government and against Cuban civilians. It is openly known as this is happening. They bombed an airplane and killed over 100 people in the 70s. They blew up hotels throughout Havana in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They know this is happening. They know what that money is used for, and they still do it because they would rather a fascist in power than a socialist anti-imperialist state, period. They've done it all over. They did it in Honduras. They did it in Bolivia. They did it in Vietnam. They did it in Cambodia. They have done it as a key strategy throughout history. The U.S. is not anti-fascist. When people were voting in the 2020 election, when Biden was running and they were trying to frame voting for Biden as an anti-fascist vote, I was like, what is wrong with y'all? Like, there is no political party in power in the United States that would actually be anti-fascist, because the strategy of propping up far-right forces is bipartisan. It's happened under Republican presidents. It's happened under Democratic presidents. The 2014 U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine that put these neo-Nazis in power happened under the Obama administration. But Joe Biden was actually like a key figure in making sure that happened. And then he put his son, Hunter Biden, on the board of a Ukrainian energy company with no qualifications. And no one's talking about that. Let me not get into it. But anyway, so this is like a bipartisan strategy to back fascist forces. They would always rather a fascist in power than a socialist or an anti-imperialist. Putin, not progressive, not socialist. The man is not socialist. But in this particular matter, he is acting in an anti-imperialist manner. And that's why they're going for his neck. Russia and China have permanent seats on the UN Security Council, which means they have a veto whenever the UN Security Council is trying to pass a resolution. Every time the UN has attempted to sanction an African country, guess what Russia and China do? They veto it. So understand, you can be someone who is conservative and reactionary, but when it comes to aligning with imperialism, we have to look at people's actual actions. What Putin is doing now by resisting NATO is a positive decision in terms of resisting Western imperialism, which is not to say that him invading Ukraine was correct, I'm actually not even going to get into it because it's not for me to say. They should not have pushed it to that point. The United States should not have antagonized the situation. They shouldn't have cooed Ukraine's democratically elected government and put Nazis in power to antagonize Russia. We got to this point because of the actions of the United States. So what Russia is going to do is what Russia is going to do. It's not for me to say whether it's right or wrong. What's for me to do as a person living in the United States is make sure that the government that I pay taxes to does not continue to escalate the situation, because this is the dangerous part that we're in right now. The US, the Western media, is now going to start a narrative that some kind of intervention is required in Ukraine to save lives, despite the fact that thousands of people have already died thanks to the action of US and NATO powers. And so now there's going to be intense pressure for the masses of people in the United States to support some kind of intervention. And what we have to do as anti-imperialists, as revolutionary socialists in the United States is say, absolutely not. Stay out of it. Start the story from the beginning. Talk about the coup in 2014, talking about the forces that were backed, talking about why Ukraine was invited to join NATO, talking about why they're encircling Russia. Russia is not our business. We have no say whatsoever in Russians' foreign policy. They are not going to listen to us. Why would they? But we do have a say in U.S. foreign policy, and we cannot use the voice we have in this context to call for more U.S. intervention. The U.S. and NATO forces created this situation because they could not stand any nation resisting Western hegemony. So what we have to do is say, stay the fuck out of it. No more U.S. intervention, not sanctions, certainly not boots on the ground. No more giving weapons to Nazis. Mind your business. And there's so much business to mind, because here in the United States, we are seeing rent increases of thousands of dollars across the entire country. We are seeing a mass ongoing eviction crisis in the middle of an ongoing deadly pandemic. We are seeing a new variant of COVID-19 emerging. BA1 is quickly becoming the dominant strain across the world. It is as virulent as Omicron. It is as deadly as Delta. And throughout the United States, they are dropping the mask mandates, y'all. They are dropping the mask mandates as this virus is spreading, and there's no national health care. It's a very bad situation. And a couple of weeks ago, we were all on the same page that the Biden administration's response to COVID has been a disaster. Now that the saber rattling has started and the Biden administration wants to recover their midterm chances by antagonizing Russia, all of a sudden it's like out of mind completely. But people are still being thrown on the street. People are still facing no access to housing because they simply cannot afford it. People are still facing COVID-19, global pandemic, without any health care. People are still facing so-called inflation, which is really just corporate greed. We see corporation after corporation making record profits during the pandemic and then hiking up prices saying they have no choice. Makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me. So there's all these problems happening domestically within the United States. Oh yeah, also an emboldened and increasingly organized far right within the United States, several members of which have traveled to Ukraine to get training from the Nazis. Yes, that's happening. Far-right forces from the United States, from Brazil, from Hong Kong, from Bolivia have traveled to Ukraine to get training from these Nazis that are funded and trained by Western powers. That's happening. So they're coming back to the United States. Do you think that's going to come up again? I'm sure it will. So we have all of these problems domestically that the Biden administration is just like utterly failing to deal with. And now all of a sudden, all of the attention has been pulled from the suffering of the people within the United States to the so-called need to antagonize Russia. So what we need to do is say, hey, leaders of the United States, mind your goddamn business and focus on the problems within your borders. Focus on the people suffering within your borders. Stop spending billions of dollars to prop up neo-Nazi and far-right political movements across the world, and instead invest that money in healthcare. Invest that money in affordable housing. Invest that money in creating actual good jobs with benefits. You know what I'm saying? Like, we got other things to deal with. So why not just do that? What else are y'all saying? Yeah, Ricky's saying he dogs the fuck out of Lenin in that speech. Correct. So that's referring to Putin's speech, where he denigrates Lenin, denigrates the USSR, and then proceeds to like talk about why NATO encroaching on Russia is unacceptable. So like I said, the man is not a communist. And it's really weird because if you talk to people in the United States about Putin, oftentimes they'll come up with like anti-communist tropes. Like they seem to really believe he's a communist. And I'm like, no, Russia, the USSR fell in the 90s, dog. Like that is not a communist country. That is a capitalist country. Certainly a less developed capitalist country than the Western countries, but still a capitalist country. The man is not a communist or a socialist or a progressive in any way.
America loves that though. They love that fucking manufacturing shit just because they don't like someone like, you know, since Russia supposedly has nukes and supposedly, you know, their military's decent and they're resisting, you know, like you said, U.S. hegemony. They're like, fuck that shit. We're gonna manufacture and do anything we can to push them to act so that we can show our citizens, hey, look, we told you that they're the bad. Russia and Putin are the big bad assholes, and that we told you they were going to do something, and look, they did it, and so now we have to react, and they're going to try and, you know, send troops and keep sending weapons and stuff because they have to defend the democracy of Ukraine, even though they undermined it already. It's funny. It's not funny, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. And it's really, yeah, like since the attack on Ukraine started, everybody is just acting brand new, forgetting or never knowing the history since 2014. But now you see people being like, stand with Ukraine, stand with the people of Ukraine, so on and so forth. And like I said, you know, tens of thousands of people have died in the Russo Ukrainian War. Ukrainian civilians have experienced pogroms, like mass killing organized by these neo-Nazi and fascist forces who are fighting in the Donbass region. So there's already been like tons of suffering on the part of Ukrainian people as a direct consequence of the actions of US and NATO powers. That's already happened. And so for people to say stand with Ukraine at this point is wild. The other thing that's really wild is when people are like the discourse I've seen is like people like scrambling to condemn Putin, right? On the left, being like, he shouldn't have done that. That's illegal. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. And I'm like, it's not a sovereign nation.
You just can't call it that.
It's not, because they were a sovereign nation. They democratically elected they chose, and then the U.S. overthrew that guy in 2014 and put the person they wanted in power. Stop calling me. Obi, I will call you back. Okay, so yeah, the point where you need to say like Ukraine is a sovereign nation is in 2014, when the president they chose was pushed out for trying to align economically with Russia. At this point, what Ukraine is experiencing is a series of puppet presidents that are solely propped up by the US and NATO. The Ukrainians, by and large, do not support neo-Nazis. Like I said, millions of people in the USSR died fighting the Nazis during World War II. These people are not pro-Nazi, but a pro-Nazi government was chosen for them. That is when you needed to say Ukraine is a sovereign nation. What we are dealing with now is correctly described as a colony of the US and NATO. It's a puppet state with a puppet government. And
they literally
go ahead.
Sorry. But Victoria Nuland, who was a part of the Obama administration and is now still a part of the Biden administration, they literally got her on the phone, talking to like another U.S. State representative, like, oh yeah, like talking about who the fuck they wanted to put in. They're like, oh, this dude, he has the support of such and such, but nah, he can't do it. What about him? He's all right. I think this guy's the one for it. Like, literally caught on tape, and so it's just.
They literally discussed like who is going to be the next president of Ukraine. No Ukrainians in the room. So please understand, if you wanted to stand for Ukrainian sovereignty, 2014 was the point to do that. Ukraine has not been a sovereign nation in 8 years. They took over a sovereign nation so they could put in place a puppet government to antagonize Russia. They are playing with people's lives to antagonize Russia because they wanted, for some reason, they got a wild hair up their ass. They want to start a new Cold War. They want to make sure that Russia is down so they can go to China. It's all doomed. It's a doomed strategy. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. I also put in the chat a number of articles that are like the receipts for not only the US and the UK and Canada and other NATO powers backing and funding and training the Nazis, but that they knew before that funding and training happened that these people were Nazis, that it was known. It was known, and they still chose to work with them because, and again, they will always choose a fascist over any, even, they don't even have to be socialist or explicitly anti-imperialist. If they go against Western hegemony, if they say, I want a trade deal with Russia instead of the United States, that's enough. That's enough. That'll trigger the overthrow. That's precisely what happened. So I put those links in the chat. Please understand. And now, like the neo-Nazi and far-right character of the powers, the US and NATO powers, backed in Ukraine, is now being questioned. Now the line that that's being said on like MSNBC and CNN is that that's like Russian propaganda. That the so-called existence of the organized neo-Nazi force in Ukraine backed by US is Russian propaganda. They're saying Putin made it up. But if you look at those articles, they were written like 2016, 2014. The US media previously was openly admitting that this was happening and being like, is someone gonna do something? Like The Nation, Time Magazine, the Ottawa Citizen, they were openly admitting that this was happening. And then when the US decided to escalate the situation, all of a sudden it became Russian propaganda. Watch what's happening. Please watch what's happening. Please pay attention. So
it's crazy though, because they say that, but they had a UN vote, I think in November of 2021, where the UN proposed some things where they were like, oh, nations should bring in measures to stop the glorification of Nazis and Hitler and and do the things that's within their power. They weren't even saying, like, they're not saying jail people and do all this stuff. They're literally just saying, hey, maybe you should bring about measures to stop the glorification of Nazis. There was 2 fucking nations who voted against it. They could have fucking abstained. They could have abstained. They could have done the right thing and just said, oh, hey, yeah, well, we'll do that. They didn't even have to, like, abide by it. They could have literally just said it and not done anything like they do all the time with the UN votes and measures to do stuff. The 2 nations who voted against that against that were the United States and Ukraine. They were like, okay, no, we're not going to tell people not to glorify Nazis. So you can say that they can say all this stuff about the fact that they didn't know and that it's Russian propaganda, but the 2 states who apparently are cool with people glorifying Nazis is Ukraine and the United States. So, yeah.
It's banana. And Jamila pointing out in the chat, the Nazi thing was major news back in 2014. Why are people talking about that as Russian propaganda? And that's correct. Like I said, the US media up until this point was openly admitting that these forces existed in Ukraine, that they were in power, and the US and NATO powers were backing them. It was just like maybe a couple of weeks ago that it started being Russian propaganda. And the reason why the US media is so confident in making that their position, even after they themselves reported on this story previously, is because they understand that the mass of the people in the United States have an extremely short-term memory and very little understanding of global context. Like, it's not trying to be insulting, it's just like a fact. And before I joined the AAPRP, I was like that as well. So the US media knows that the US public will accept what they're saying. The other part about it is that we have been set up for this moment. And what I mean by that is that Russiagate, that made up shit, like there was never any evidence of anything they were saying. To this day, there's no evidence. It was made up. But what Russiagate did was allow the United States to frame Russia as an existential threat to US democracy, to global democracy. And people ate that shit up because they hated Trump. They hated Trump. And so these past, like, you know, how long has it been? My God, it's been like 5-6 years of this like made up Russiagate nonsense. It was priming people for this moment. It was priming people to think of Putin as a Hitler style villain, like twirling the mustache. Like they were preparing us for this moment. They were preparing us for US intervention in Russia, US intervention in Eastern Europe. So we are in a rough place because now the US anti-war movement, which is itself deeply confused, is in the position of having to call for no war against a man that they have already accepted as their enemy because of propaganda from the ruling class that's gone on for years. So it's just like, woo, good luck to us. It's going to be rough out here. It's going to be very rough. But yeah, we still have to do it. We have to, as anti-imperialists, as socialists, as people who are just for peace and social justice in the United States, say that we do not accept any kind of intervention by the United States into this situation. We have to call for the abolition of NATO. NATO cannot be expanded. Like I said, it doesn't matter if it's happening in Ukraine. It doesn't matter if it's happening in Mexico. Any expansion of NATO is a threat to the African liberation struggle. They have already used NATO against us. They have already used NATO to repress anti-colonial struggles in Africa and across the world. We don't need an expanded NATO, period. So we have to call for the abolishment of NATO, say no U.S. intervention in Russia, no war with Russia, no U.S. intervention in Ukraine, period. I also want to share this article that was published on Hood Communist. Like, we've been on it. Black Alliance for Peace has been on it. Hood Communist has been on it. When no one was really talking about Ukraine because it wasn't on the news, so they didn't care. We were still saying, like, this is bad. Like, let's talk about this. Like, why? Let's talk about why this is happening. So I want to share this article on Ukraine. It's called Ukraine, What Black Folks Have to Know. And I definitely encourage folks to check it out. It's basically like the written version of what I've been trying to explain to you in colorful languages for the entire program. It also crucially has some clear suggestions for what needs to happen to de-escalate this situation. Because we have to remember that Russia is a nuclear power, and NATO has already floated the idea of giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine. So any kind of intervention from the US and NATO powers, any kind of escalation by handing Ukraine nuclear weapons could make this a situation that's deadly for the whole planet. So understand that there needs to be some kind of diplomatic resolution to this problem. It can't keep escalating. It needs to be de-escalated. And so in this article, there are clear suggestions for what needs to happen to de-escalate the situation. First and foremost, uphold the goddamn Minsk agreements. Uphold the goddamn Minsk agreements. The only reason this is happening is because the U.S. told Ukraine to ignore the Minsk agreement that Ukraine itself agreed to. It was a non-violent diplomatic solution to tensions between Russia and Ukraine. None of this would have happened if Ukraine had just followed the Minsk agreements, or if the U.S. had just let the Ukrainians pick their own goddamn president. That's what happened. So uphold the Minsk agreement is the first suggestion. In that article, it should be said that in the speech that Putin gave on Monday, he says that Minsk is moot now because he's recognizing the independence of these two regions. So who even knows if it's still on the table? But it should be. Second suggestion is that the U.S. and its allies should cease unnecessary provocations, including increased arms sales to Ukraine and suggested NATO membership. Ukraine cannot join NATO. It's bad for Russia. It's also bad for all of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements on this planet. We cannot accept any expansion of NATO. When people call that shit a defensive military alliance, I'm like, then why are they constantly invading places? Why do they kill thousands of people to stop the spread of communism? How is that defensive? Please stop. On my face. It's not defensive. It is a white supremacist, colonial as fuck military alliance. It is not defensive. We cannot allow it to expand. No NATO membership for Ukraine. On that point, Russia is right. They are right. Also, last thing is that potential threats to international peace should be taken up by the United Nations, subjected to provisions of the United Nations Charter and other elements of international law instead of arbitrary and illegal actions by any state or regional formation. There should have been a diplomatic approach to this issue pursued from the very beginning. The United States and NATO powers had no business whatsoever overthrowing the president that Ukrainians chose simply because he quite rationally wanted to build stronger economic ties with Russia. Instead, they wanted them to sign a trade deal with the imperialist ass United States as a semi-colonial nation. Why would they do that? So please, there was no reason whatsoever for any of this to happen. We have to understand that we got to this point because of antagonism and deeply irrational diplomacy on the part of the US and Western powers. Putin is not like a maniac or whatever. He's actually just acting in the best interest of Russia's security. That's it.
You can't blame him. Yeah, I can't blame him for that either. So.
No. If he literally just sat back and watched as all of the nations around Russia join NATO, that would be suicidal. It would be suicidal. People have to understand, and the reason why people buy it is because they have like a really like Orientalist, frankly racist conception of what's happening in Eastern Europe. So yeah, it's bad out here. And then also on the screen, let me do this. Yeah, I put on the screen this link to the Black Alliance for Peace resource page on Ukraine. And so if you want to get even deeper info about what's happening, why it's happening, who's involved, and for what reasons, please check out that link. Please get your knowledge up on this particular subject because, like I said, at this particular point, it is extremely dangerous. People are emotional. People are reacting. People are calling for someone to do something, which usually turns to calls for a so-called humanitarian intervention. When humanitarian intervention happens by the West, thousands more people die. So we can't not allow this to happen. No sanctions, no humanitarian intervention, no more weapons to Ukraine. Absolutely not. If you want to understand why we're saying this, please check out the link and the resources that we put in the chat. So that's what's going on with Ukraine. Oh yeah, last thing I want to say is that when Western powers, the US, are ramping up to antagonize a country with the intent of some kind of intervention, we see a lot of media demonizing them, which is certainly going to happen in this particular case. One of the things that's already happened is claims that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine and commit atrocities against LGBTQ people, queer and trans people. That's already been out there. People are saying they're going to make camps for queer people. First of all, the neo-Nazis and far-right political forces that the US and NATO powers have been funding and training and supporting for the last 8 years have engaged in organized campaigns of mass violence in Ukraine against Russian-speaking queer and trans people, against communists, against Jewish people. This is who the US said was the resistance. And like I said, they knew these people were Nazis. They knew these people were fascists. They knew what would happen if they took power because it was happening during the protests. And they still funded, trained, and politically supported these forces who then went on to commit atrocities against queer and trans people, against communists, and against Jewish people. This is already happening. So regardless of whatever reactionary position Russia has against queer and trans people, understand that any kind of intervention that backs these far-right forces in power in Ukraine is not going to improve the situation for LGBTQ people. It's not. The US has to stay out of it, and that cannot be used as the excuse. The other thing that's really important is that the Nazis and the far-right fascists committed these atrocities against these groups in Ukraine. And also here in the United States, we are seeing fascist laws being put forward to criminalize queer and trans people. For example, yesterday in Texas, Governor Abbott released an executive order calling for teachers to report queer and trans students, to police and surveil their gender presentation and report if it varied from what was accepted. This is an executive order put out by Greg Abbott yesterday, calling for teachers and social workers to surveil queer and trans students and police their gender presentation. In Florida, a bill recently passed called the Don't Say Gay bill. It passed the Florida House today. And what that bill is calling for is to forbid discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. That's why it's called Don't Say Gay. All across the United States, far-right and fascist forces are advancing similar legislation. They are banning books. They are policing gender representation. They are talking about what history can and cannot be taught. I do not know if y'all are paying attention, but the far right, both outside and within structures of state power in the United States, is increasingly organized and emboldened. At the same time as this is happening, the government that you voted for, most likely if you voted and you watched this show, you voted for Biden. So you voted for this. They are funding and training far-right forces across the world, including in Ukraine. Do you see how a far-right pan-European movement is forming and getting increasingly organized and being backed by the United States and Western powers? Do you see what's happening? Do you see what's happening? We got shit to worry about here. Ukraine, like whatever contradictions in Russia exist, the Russian people have to deal with. Whatever contradictions in Ukraine exist, the Ukrainian people have to deal with. We have a responsibility to make sure that this government does not make things worse over there, and that the far-right forces that are organizing here in support in both domestically and globally have someone to counter them, have someone to resist that, period. So please do not call for humanitarian intervention. Please do not call for sanctions. I personally believe it's a waste of time to say critiques about Putin. Like, your moral stance makes no motherfucking difference. It makes no difference whatsoever, except adding to the consensus that says that Putin's an evil monster that must be put down. So yeah, worry about yourself. Worry about what's happening here. Let us organize and stop this because it's getting worse. And please check out those resources right there to learn more about what's happening. Okay, so that's the Ukraine situation. That took like a long time, but I had a lot to say. I was mad. So other thing I want to talk about is in Haiti, we have seen ongoing mass mobilizations of workers in sweatshops run by American corporations who are calling to an increase to Haiti's minimum wage. Mobilizations of thousands of people. Did you know? Did you know? Did you see it on the news? I bet you didn't, because when Haiti is rising up against capitalism, imperialism, the U.S. media is like, quiet. When counter-revolutionary protests pop up in Venezuela, Hong Kong, Bolivia, all over the news. So yeah, you probably have not heard about this. But yep, currently, workers in Haiti in these sweatshops that are run like by American retailers such as Walmart, Target, JCPenney, Gap are making $4 a day. They are in the streets demanding an increase to $14.59 per day. So yeah, they're asking for what they say is a living wage in Haiti, and also want to know that the wages in Haiti were deliberately depressed by the U.S. government. It was a trade agreement championed by Hillary Clinton, as a matter of fact, that put them at $4 per day. So the mass people are Haiti out in the streets. They are being fired upon by Haitian police forces deployed by the Ariel Henry government. The Ariel Henry government, in response to these protests, offered to raise the minimum wage to like $7 a day. And people were like, no, we said 14. So the protests are ongoing and they deserve our unconditional support. We also have to understand that the so-called great resignation and like grassroots labor movement that's been unfolding among low-wage workers in the United States has a clear basis of unity with these Haitian workers calling for a minimum wage increase, because they make the clothes that are sold in the stores that the people in the United States calling for higher wages and better benefits work at. So if you work in Target and the people that make the clothes in Target are both saying we don't accept how Target's treating us, you need to come together across borders and fight together, fight side by side. But either way, we're going to continue to monitor these protests. Our hearts are with the massive African people in Haiti. That is one nation that has never accepted what capitalism and imperialism has done within its borders. Every time a puppet is put in there, every time a democratic government is overthrown, every time they open up sweatshops, the Haitian people are out there by the thousands saying absolutely not. This resistance, this legacy of resistance goes all the way back to the Haitian Revolution, of course. So shout out to Haiti for never accepting what is being done to it. Also, in Mali, the French are ending an 8-year military occupation in that country. They were effectively chased out by the masses of African people in Mali who mobilized on a mass basis for years saying, please get the hell out of our nation. France is now leaving, pulling troops out of Mali. They're talking about deploying troops in another place in the Sahel. And of course, the UN troops are still there. But we have to understand that this development is a direct consequence of the masses of people in Mali rising up and saying, get out of our land. If you want to learn more about what's happening in Mali and why we as revolutionary Pan-Africanists and anti-imperialists should support it, please check out another AAPRP podcast, the Forward Ever podcast, put together by another work study circle, where they talk in depth about what's happening in Mali and why, and how we can support from the United States and the diaspora. So please check it out. I put the link in the chat. So that's it for World Geo. And now I'm going to take a break from talking by passing it to Rashad.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the next topic we're gonna talk about is the COVID situation, especially in America. But we'll get into how it relates to the rest of the world too. And so, because also, I was supposed to do more readings on the COVID situation, and I didn't, and I'm mad. But so we'll talk about it together. so so but we, as Onyesonwu said though, there's the new variant, the BA1, is that it? Yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, the BA1 variant, it's looking like it's worse than the Delta and the Omicron variant, and that's like, to me that's to be expected, because that's usually how it goes. You might get one that's a little bit less, but then the next one that comes, if you're not doing the right things, which America is not doing, well, then that's how you get variations that are. That's how you get variations in general, which can be anywhere from mild to severe as fuck. So, they're doing, like, as that's happening, we know that they're dropping the mask mandates. Everyone is going to point to, well, a lot of people will point to New York, to me, because, I think there's a big talk around what the basketball player Kyrie Irving is doing, and how he hasn't been able to play in games. And now New York is repealing that, and he's going to be allowed to play in home games, which, it just, it is what it is, because they've been allowing people to play in New York in general. But the fact that these things go on, like that fact that they're repealing mask mandates at the same time that we're getting new variants that are seemingly worse. At the very least, it's a new variant, and we don't even have enough time to understand it before they start doing things and repealing stuff and making folks go back to work. And every single point during the pandemic, that's what they've done. They've deflected. Uh, they've they've lied. They've misled us. They've just extremely failed at keeping us safe, keeping us uh, not not in hospitals and not dead. And they really don't care. Like, through this whole time, you just see that the whole thing is that they need us to work, and they don't care if we die in the process. And so, to me, the whole argument that we shouldn't trust the government, we shouldn't take vaccines, that is what it is. But at the same token, they don't they want us to get vaccines because they know that they think that that'll help get us back to work faster, without in the like in the least with the least amount of, like, obstruction, I guess you can say, for them. because they don't have to pay for anything. They don't have to give us money. They don't have to, like other governments have done. They don't have to give us money during the pandemic to stay home to work. I mean, to stay home and not go to work, and or to. So, that's the whole thing. They want us to work, and they don't care if we die in the process. And it's crazy because we're able to demonize all these other countries. I know everyone's heard about the at what cost thing when they talk about, when the West and America specifically talks about China and their zero COVID policy, and it's always about at what cost. And we saw just with the Olympic Games that the whole time from the start of the games, even before the start, we'll start the start of the games throughout and to the very fucking bitter end. The whole talking point for America in the mainstream media was, oh my God, they're doing all these things to stop people from getting COVID. The games aren't fun, and it's all this stuff about, well, why are they they're mad at China for having a zero COVID policy, but they want everyone to get vaccinated here. It just doesn't really. None of their stuff makes sense. They contradict themselves at every single point during the whole pandemic. No matter if it was Trump, Biden, or whoever, they just contradict themselves because I don't know. In my opinion, I feel like they have to, because they can't toe a straight line and think everything is going to be okay. You know what I mean? Like, they can't say, oh, well, China's policy of zero COVID is bad, and so fuck vaccines, fuck everything. They can't do that. So they have to latch onto the only thing they can. That's the path of least resistance, and that's trying to get everyone vaccinated, which people should get vaccinated, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. But without that was never supposed to be the only thing. That's common fucking sense. You can't just say everyone get vaccinated and then make kids go to school just because they might not die from COVID. Like, they still are able to catch it and pass it on. And so, like, the thing is that I think they know these things. That they know that it could never have been just a straight vaccine thing. That should have been one of a multitude of things that they had to do to keep the people safe and keep COVID from spreading and variants from popping up. And so I believe they knew this, and I mean, I think it's obvious because I don't think that that's a mystery. But that's the thing. They don't care. They're gonna take the vaccines because that's easy for them. They can also make money off of it and trying to sell it to other countries, even if they're fucking even if the doses are even if the doses are expired, which they do and stuff like that. I've seen I can't remember what countries they've sent it to, but I think a number of African countries who got expired doses of vaccines. And so it's unfortunate what we have to go through, and they're trying to make us live with COVID and like make it seem like it's endemic. I don't know if it's true, but I did hear that they're like trying to stop counting COVID deaths and all these things. It's not funny because we're almost at 1 million people dead, and that is, if nothing else is dystopian to people, I think that should be fairly dystopian, because we see, and it should highlight the contradiction between the fact that between capitalism and socialism. And so even if you don't want to categorize Vietnam or China as socialist, which to me is silly, they're socialist countries. But at the very least, even if you don't, you can see the difference in how a country who cares about their citizens reacts to a country who does not give a single shit about the people that they supposedly represent and lead. Because we see, I think there was 1 or 2 deaths, COVID deaths in China in 2021. And so even if there was 1,000, it wouldn't even compare to what the fuck we've seen in America in the past year and in the pandemic in its entirety. I remember people getting mad at Trump in the beginning because he had said something about, oh, well, if we reach 150,000 deaths, well, that'll be all right. Like we can live with that. And people are like, oh my God, 150,000 deaths, it's fucking crazy. That's a lot of people. We're at fucking, I don't even know the number, and I'm sorry, I should know the number, but I know it's over 600,000 people. And so the response from America has been pathetic. It's been sad. It's been completely unfortunate. It's been deadly. And to me, it highlights the contradiction, because capitalism can't deal with a global pandemic in a good way. It's impossible. It can't, because it puts profit. The whole thing is profit over people. And so we see, I think Onyesonwu said that all these corporations, I think the major corporations wealth went up $3.6 trillion, and fucking the wealth of every single other person, the regular people, us workers, dropped, I think, 3.1 trillion. And so we see the direct correlation of how putting profits above people, even in a global pandemic, is completely contradictory to life in general. Like, it just, capitalism, it has to do these things. It can't respond. It doesn't, if you have a for-profit healthcare system, well, then obviously when a global pandemic comes, then you're going to see people not wanting to get tested because they have to pay for it. You're going to see people not want to go to the doctor to even check because they have to go to work, and all these things. It's a whole combined thing, and it all revolves around the capitalist imperialist system. And so it's unfortunate, and I don't really know what the fuck to do, at all. I just be sitting here like, I know we can't just live with it, and I'm not prepared to. But that's what they're literally forcing it on us, and I'm like, well, dude, I don't know what the fuck to do now, because if you're gonna stop counting deaths and you're gonna stop doing all these things, then they're really just trying to force us to live with it, and I feel like defeated as fuck when it comes to COVID and America and their response. So yeah, that's basically it for the COVID part of this, at least from my point.
Folks are pointing out in the chat that although the official count is 941 deaths in the United States, it is actually almost certainly much higher, because there's never been any kind of contact tracing. There's never been any kind of organized systematic mass testing. So there's never really been any idea of how many COVID cases there actually are in the United States. And so there's no question that deaths have been undercounted, and they will continue to be undercounted, especially as various government agencies, the CDC, for example, moves towards treating COVID as endemic and calls for less data to be tracked. At this point, most of the tests that are being done in the United States are home tests. When you take a PCR test, the result is automatically tracked. When you take a home test, unless you submit your results to a state database, it's not tracked. So there's no possible way we could even know how many COVID infections there are in the United States anymore. But in terms of what to do, and I talked about this, the Hood Communist team, we had an event with Black Alliance for Peace last week, and we got asked this question of how do you include queer and trans and gender variant people in the narrative of the African liberation struggle and the true history of the African liberation struggle. And I gave the example, I basically said we have to study those movements, study their politics, study their tactics, not just name names. People will be James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, who was a counter-revolutionary. They're just Marsha P. Johnson, They're just throw out names with no other context. And that to me is not actually centering those people or honoring them in any kind of way. It's just name dropping them. And so instead what we have to do is read about how they actually organize. So Marsha P. Johnson was part of this organization called ACT UP that was formed in the 80s as a grassroots response to the failure of the US government to deal with the AIDS pandemic. Mm-hmm. We've already actually been through this. The US government under Reagan and then Bush completely ignored mass deaths that were happening in queer communities across the United States from AIDS. And so those communities organized on a grassroots level. They focused on studying the science and explaining it to people. And this is where I think that we can actually, like, we have fallen short, but we can catch up, because what happened with COVID-19 is people were like, listen to science, listen to science, listen to science. Like, science in the capitalist society is actually objective. It's not. We actually just found that out when the CDC was like, actually five-day quarantine is fine, when Delta wrote a letter. So clearly that's not a decision based on science. Clearly that's a decision based on profit. So we don't like listen to the science. Science is not objective. So we have a responsibility to read like the actual science, these studies that have been done on COVID-19 and its variants. I'm very sure it's going to be hard to understand, but we have to read that shit, the primary sources, and then explain it in plain language to our people. Right now, there is drastic misinformation coming from the U.S. government. There are mass mandates ending all across the United States. I live in a so-called blue state. The governor just ended our mass mandate last week as this new variant, BA1, is emerging. So governments are no longer so-called listening to the science. They are moving to pretend like this is over. We have a responsibility to elevate what's actually happening, go to the primary sources, and then share what we learn with our people. Democratize the knowledge is how ACT UP referred to it. So we have to do that. They also organized medical mutual aid, medical community defense programs, where they were fundraising to get people medical treatment, where they were getting supplies of HIV medication and distributing to them. So like there's all these lessons that we can take from the grassroots movement that emerged in response to the US government ignoring the AIDS pandemic. I'm going to put this article I was reading in the chat right now, and I encourage folks to check it out. It was clearly written by like a cis queer European person, because that is who is focused on in the article. It was very clear. However, there's an incredible amount of detail about how they actually organize, about how they democratize the knowledge, organize these medical community defense programs that we need to learn from, because we need to do this. We have accepted for too long a failed COVID response from the US government. We have deferred, those of us who care about social justice, to the narrative of the US government. Meanwhile, the US government's like, you don't need a mask. If you get the vaccine, you can't catch COVID, which is a lie. It's a lie, but they've been saying that. And so now there's like a mass amount of confusion. It's no wonder, like they made us like fight amongst ourselves about it, but they actually caused it. So we as organizers, as revolutionaries, as socialists need to organize a grassroots pandemic response. The latest studies released say that if we continue on the current trajectory, COVID is not going to be over until 2025. I told someone that on Saturday and I made her really depressed. I apologize, but that's where we're at. That's where we're at. If we continue on this current trajectory, we are dealing with COVID until 2025. I also want to say that variant that Rashad mentioned, the BA1 variant, here is an Associated Press article about it that's pretty good. And it's bad out here, y'all. It's bad out here. Like I said, it's more virulent than Omicron. It is as deadly as Delta. It cannot yet be independently identified in tests. It shows up like as Delta. They're having trouble tracking it. So yeah, it's bad out here. It's bad out here. So please check out that Cosmonaut article talking about the grassroots AIDS organizing. The other cool thing about that article is that it like gives you like a list of books to read for more information. So I'm gonna read those books because we have to organize a grassroots pandemic response. Otherwise, we're gonna watch another million more people die over the next 3 years that we have left dealing with this. This is where we're at. So yeah, that's that. I put that AP News article about BA1 in the chat. If you have like started being lax about the precautions, please stop. Like, please continue to wear your mask if you're around other people. It protects other people, particularly are like disabled folks and elders, but it also protects you. It protects you. I went to Florida twice during the pandemic and I double masked it. And I went to go visit my sister who has asthma, who is high risk. We met outside. I was double masked. We social distanced. I did not get sick. She did not get sick. Her kids did not get sick. So masks work. It's going to be weird now to wear a mask in public because they're ending the mask mandates and they've been incredibly politicized in the United States. So maybe you might get weird shit about it, but you know what you won't get? COVID. So please continue to wear a mask. If you can get an N95, those are the best. I actually got a bunch of N95s from this website, wellbefore.com. So if you need N95 masks, check it out, wellbefore.com. And you can like get them on a subscription, so they'll mail them to you every month. It's kind of cool. And you can also get COVID tests from there as well. Also, continue to social distance. Like if you're out in public, if you're inside with other people, social distance, keep that 6 feet. Like it's still important. I usually try to meet folks outside. I had dinner with my friend on Saturday. We sat outside in the wintertime. It's fine. Like I don't want to catch COVID. I want to get people sick. So that's what we do. Also, like Rashad said, if you want to get vaccinated, if you are able to get vaccinated, please get vaccinated. Please do it. You can still catch COVID if you get a vaccine, but it'll be milder. So you can still catch COVID. You can still give people COVID, which is why it's important to continue to mask, even if you're vaccinated, but it will make it milder and you'll be less likely to be hospitalized. Also, if you are not active in an organization fighting for justice, now is the time to join an organization, because in order to organize the kind of mass grassroots pandemic response that's going to be needed, and again, we have at least 3 more years of this, we need everybody involved. We need all hands on deck. We need everybody to build their skills and their experience and their knowledge so we can accomplish this together. And it's absolutely possible. They did it in the 80s in response to HIV/AIDS, so we can absolutely do it now. But we have to realize that no one's going to come and do it for us. We have to do it ourselves. So please join the organization fighting for justice. Wear your mask, social distance, get vaccinated. If you're able to like minimize your time in public, indoors, please do so. I know it sucks. I know it's been like a long ass time, but it's still really important to do it because this shit's not over. It's not over no matter what they say. It seems like it's about to get worse with this new variant. So we have to be diligent. We have to be extremely careful. We have to be militant about keeping each other safe because they are not going to help us. Anywho, so that was the COVID updates. Thank you so much, Rashad. Let's move to the closing because we've been on here long enough. It's enough. So, like I said, this show happens on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of each month, which means the next one is going to be on Thursday, March 10th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. We are hoping to do an interview for that episode, some special guests. So stay tuned for who those people are. I don't want to say it in case they say they can't do it, you know. So yeah, but yeah, we're going to be back here March 10th, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, this coming Sunday at 3 p.m. Mountain Time, the AAPRP Anti-War Coalition and the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade are hosting a virtual Cuba Solidarity event. We're going to watch a video that's like really racist and imperialist and break it down. And we're going to do another quiz show with slightly different rules. If you want to know what it's going to be like, then please join us. I just dropped the link to register in the chat. So you can register via Zoom to join us in Zoom, or it's going to be streamed to our Facebook page and our YouTube as well, so you can watch it there. But if you want to be in the quiz, if you want to be part of the game, you got to be in the Zoom. So please register if you want to be there. And then also, we are constantly engaged in community work for our people here in Tiwa territory. We are in the midst of planning the reopening of the Pan-African Community Garden. Our elder care program is ongoing. We are constantly raising funds. We are not a nonprofit. We don't get grants. We don't have any kind of corporate backing. All of our work is grassroots. All of our work is supported by our community, by our people. And so if you want to support the work of AAPRP Southwest chapter, particularly as we expand against throughout the U.S. Southwest, then the donation link is right there. It's right there. You can Venmo us, you can PayPal us, and everything you donate will go to supporting the work of the AAPRP here in the U.S. Southwest and throughout the world. We give a portion of our funds to AAPRP International so it can be distributed to chapters in Africa. So yeah, please donate. We love you. And then lastly, I just want to end by saying, if you are not in an organization fighting for justice, you need to get in an organization fighting for justice. We got 3 more years of a deadly pandemic. We have a pan-European far-right fascist movement getting increasingly organized domestically and internationally. There is no way you can vote that's going to get us out of this. It's about to get really, really, really bad, like much worse. And our survival as African people as queer and trans people, as poor and working class people, as indigenous people, is dependent upon us getting organized to protect each other and to defend ourselves. That's the only way we're gonna make it as things continue to get much worse. There's no end at this point. It's just downhill from here until we are organized enough to stop it. So if you're not active in an organization fighting for justice, please join an organization. Look at me, I am serious. Join an organization, get in the fight. If you are an African, we will welcome you in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Please join us. If you're not African, there are dozens, hundreds of organizations for you. Black Rose, DSA, IWW, here in
PSL.
PSL, Workers' World Party. Like, you got options. Please pick one. Get in there. Start making your contribution. So thank you so much for joining us for Weekly Pan-African News. It seemed like the tech went a lot well this time, so shout out to that. And we will see you on Thursday, March 10th.